I take it you reached the zenith of your career when at age 12 you were co-host of the Tween Set TV series?
Yes, that's also correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you did on Tween Set?
I conducted interviews and made idle chatter with people on live television. As you indicated, it was the zenith of my career, and I was strongly encouraged to apply to medical school.
I take it you declined that advice, and from 1971 to 75 spent summers as a relief announcer and interviewer for CBC television and radio. Is that right?
That is correct. When I discovered you could be paid an inordinate amount of money for once an hour saying, "This is CBC," I signed up immediately.
All right. I'm not going to go through your numerous failed roles as an actor, but what I'd like to focus on is your classical piano training. I understand when acting did not work out, you then decided to subject the world to your musical talents.
That is correct.
All right. And I also understand that you've recently completed 8 years on the board of the Stratford Festival.
Yes, I was let off after 8 years.
And in the course of your acting, singing, TV, radio, and piano career, I understand you did some medicine on the side.
Briefly as a hobby, yes.
Now, I want to talk to you about your examination of Hamlet in this. Take any objection to the qualifications of Dr. Goldblum?
Well, but based upon his opinion,
Not render any kind of psychiatric opinion without a direct interview of the subject. So I met with Hamlet at the Revel Cafe here in Stratford. You might say I had coffee with a Danish. And I had the opportunity to interview him in character for over an hour with regard to the alleged crimes.
All right. And can you tell me the results of that interview?
Yes, based on that assessment and based on collateral evidence available to me through scholarly writing through the ages about Hamlet, I came to the conclusion that there was no evidence for a major mental disorder of the nature that would compromise his ability to understand and appreciate the nature of his actions at the time of the death of Polonius.
Can I just go back to the interview you conducted
Yes.
with Hamlet? During the course of it, can you describe his demeanor?
Yes, he was pleasant, he was cooperative, he had a tendency to ramble, quite frankly. And I had to redirect him, particularly when he wasn't looking at me, but rather gazing off into the distance. However, his thought form was coherent. There was no evidence when I interviewed him of psychosis and no evidence of impairments in his cognition or his judgment.
Now, when you were interviewing him, you discussed the murder
Yes.
of Polonius, and I understand that he made some statements to you at that time. Can you recall what those statements were?
Yes, and without wishing to cause offense to anyone, he indicated to me quite plainly that when he discovered that the person he had killed was Polonius rather than Claudius, he said to me, "I knew then I had really fucked up."
I also understand that Hamlet discussed with you a little bit his somewhat strong feelings towards his mother. Can you tell us a little bit about what he said about that?
Yes, and this indeed has been, in my reading of the collateral information, a source of endless speculation. He was understandably quite enraged with his mother in his time of grief that she chose to marry his uncle. But as for any evidence of some kind of unrequited sexual longing for his mother, as has been postulated in psychoanalytic writing, he said simply Oedipus Schmedipus.
Did he at any time during the interview suggest to you that he was not aware that he was killing a human being or that he was not aware of the circumstances of the crime?
No, he indicated quite clearly to me that when he heard a voice behind the arras and thrust at it with his rapier, that he knew that in the absence of adequate sterilization of a rapier, that death by sepsis eventually or death by blood loss immediately would be the likely result of stabbing someone.
Now, I take it you discussed with Hamlet the fact that he claims to have seen ghosts?
Yes, we discussed the issue of ghosts at length.
All right. And I take it you also discussed the issue of his father's death at length?
Yes.
All right. Can you tell us a little bit about your discussion in terms of the ghosts and Hamlet's feelings about his father's death?
Yes. Hamlet indicated to me that he had had questions and concerns about the nature of his father's death right from the moment he first learned of it, given that his father had been a man in good health and relatively young. And as is evident to anyone who has read the story, Hamlet was not the first person to see the said ghost. In fact, he was the fourth person to encounter the ghost. At the same time, he indicated to me that he was not sure what exactly he was seeing. Whether this was a manifestation of his own imagination, whether it was a real ghost, but in any case, the message that he took from it was that he had to seek more real-world confirmation of both his own suspicions and the allegations made by the ghost.
All right. And did he set about doing that?
Indeed, he set about constructing an elaborate entrapment for Claudius by devising a play. This was a very well thought-out initiative.
All right. In your opinion, in your expert acting opinion, did he suffer from any major depressive episode?
No, and allow me just to differentiate grief from depression. There's been great concern raised about the over-medicalization of normal human experience. And bereavement is indeed one of those areas where the separation of bereavement from the illness of major depression is an important one to make. Hamlet exhibits many aspects of bereavement, but none of the sustained symptoms that would be associated with severe major depression.
All right. So is it fair to say in conclusion, Dr. Goldblum, your diagnosis is Hamlet was just sad?
I would say Hamlet was bereaved. He was sad. He was at times annoying. But none of those, in my view, constitute a major mental disorder with sequelae that would render someone not criminally responsible for their actions.
Thank you very much. I believe my friend may have some questions for you.
Dr. Goldblum, you'll forgive me, I've just been recently retained in this matter. But I understand that in your report, and what you've just discussed, you thought it essential to interview Hamlet. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I understand in psychiatric terms and psychiatric forensic evaluations, of which you've done none prior to this one. Is that correct, sir?
Well, as of tomorrow, one.
Yeah. Is it not fair that in addition to interviewing the person who you're assessing, it's important to get a baseline? In other words, to determine the opinions and the views of those who know him well. Fair enough?
That would be reasonable if I was being paid for this work. Yes.
Well, you were in Stratford interviewing Hamlet.
Yes, that's correct.
Did you inquire as to whether or not you might also have join you at lunch Claudius?
Well, sir, I was on a limited budget. I covered coffee and a scone for the prince.
How about Gertrude or Ophelia or Polonius, all of whom knew him well?
Indeed, sir, I relied on their spoken words as captured by the playwright to inform my opinion regarding his mental
But
state.
all of them, I suggest to you, comment on his descent into stark raving cuckoo bananahood.
Well, sir, I think the correct Latin term that you and I would have both grown up with, ganz meshuggah, may be one of those terms, like madness in the play, that is applied rather generically to a range of behaviors that can go from a capital offense to buying retail. So,
let me ask you, Dr. Groucho, a very important part of what we know about the transcript of these proceedings.
yes.
Doctor, did you know in which direction the wind was blowing when Hamlet stabbed Polonius?
I believe it was blowing southerly. And I say that because Hamlet indicates very clearly that he is but mad north-northwest, and when the wind is southerly, he knows a hawk from a handsaw, which is an incredibly important piece of differentiation if you're trying to cut a 2x4 in half. A hawk will leave huge talon marks and feathers everywhere.
Doctor, with great respect,
Yes.
your evidence that you've just given is conclusion-driven. Your conclusion is that he's sane, therefore the wind must have been blowing in the direction that it blows when you can't tell the difference between a hawk and a handsaw. Correct?
I assumed, sir, you were speaking metaphorically rather than literally.
I suggest to you, sir, that if the wind, in fact, was blowing north-northwest, then upon Hamlet's own admission, he was mad. Fair enough?
Fair enough, but I think that assumes that somebody was tuned into the Weather Channel at Elsinore on that day to know the wind direction, and I don't know.
Let's talk about this ghost, because in your report you express the view, and I'll quote from your report, the experience of auditory and visual hallucinations is not uncommon.
That is correct. In bereavement.
You then listed circumstances when it might be normal.
Yes.
I'd suggest to you, Doctor, that having a ghost tell you a story and then ordering you to kill someone doesn't fall under your category of not uncommon. Fair enough?
Fair enough.
In your report, you also provide the opinion that, and you say, even without the perception of this ghost, his suspicions of his uncle and his plans to act on them were already established. Fair recitation of your report.
That is correct.
I suggest to you, Doctor, that there's no evidence before his little confab with the ghost that he suspected his uncle. Isn't that correct?
No, that's not correct in the sense that my conversation with Hamlet over a scone indicated clearly to me that he had his doubts, he had his concerns, and he had his suspicions regarding his father's death, but that was cut from the script in out-of-town tryouts in Manchester.
And more than 400 years after the fact, you've resurrected that little tidbit. Fair enough?
Correct.
I suggest to you that really at the base of this was initially He was melancholy about his father's death, fair enough?
Yes. And angry.
And he took exception to his mother's new relationship.
That's correct.
But his concerns, I suggest to you, didn't lead to a belief that Claudius was the killer until he hears it from the ghost.
No, I would say that fueled his concerns, but his suspicions were only confirmed in the wake of his uncle's reaction to seeing the mousetrap play.
Well, you'll agree with me that the ghost tells him the entire story of his death.
Yes.
He begs Hamlet to commit a murder.
He begs him to seek revenge. He doesn't get specific about how that should happen.
Well, I suggest to you that others who heard or who saw the apparition never heard the voice of the apparition. Fair
That's
enough?
correct.
And there is, I suggest, a qualitative difference between seeing in bereavement an apparition and hearing the directive voice of the ghost instructing him to do the evil deeds.
I would agree with the exception around the reality of my experience of dealing with many patients over the last 30 years who do experience auditory or visual hallucinations, is that they are virtually never of the quality or temporal sequence that is witnessed by Hamlet in the depths of despair. For most people, these are sustained, ongoing, and tormenting, not single episodes of direction.
Well, you'll agree that the second time Hamlet talks to the ghost, his mother is in the room with him.
Correct.
You'd agree that Gertrude does not see or hear anything.
That is correct.
I suggest to you that if the ghost could really talk, could really tell people what to do, he'd want to have a word with his ex-wife. Who married the man who murdered him. Fair?
I'm not so sure that he would want to have a conversation with her at that point in her marital trajectory.
Well, excuse me for a moment. Doctor, do you recognize this skull?
Alas, poor Yenkel, I knew him well.
Well, so you knew York.
I never forget a skull.
Well, Doctor, I suggest to you it's one thing for Hamlet to be talking to ghosts, or specifically to be listening to those ghosts as they order him about. But here, Hamlet speaks about and to the skull of his former jester, York, now recently known as the uncle. Fair enough?
Yes.
What does he have to say? He's looking at a skull. He's amazed that death could come to something that had such life in it. I suggest, Doctor, Hamlet can't even understand the concept of death. He's convinced that his dead father is walking around purgatory as a ghost, and when Polonius dies, he pays such little mind to the death that he immediately starts yelling at his mother about her love life. I suggest he's totally detached from the reality of death itself.
Well, I would certainly endorse the idea that somebody told Hamlet to get ahead in life. But his detachment from death, I would take exception to. We see ample evidence throughout the play that he is indeed preoccupied with death. The death of his father, the question of his own death, the fate of Ophelia, there are numerous deaths, and of course, by the end of the play, had you stayed to Act 5, you would have seen that the bodies were literally piling up on the stage.
Well, Doctor, who holds the skull anyway? It's actually quite
Besides you.
It's unpleasant. Well, you have to remember, I'm doing it because Hamlet's paying me an ungodly hourly rate. I suggest that unless you're an extraordinarily well-paid barrister, holding a skull while extolling the person's virtue is simply an insane thing to do.
You may be able, sir, to isolate examples of behavior that you feel is, in that particular moment, indicative of highly aberrant behavior. But my task was to preoccupy myself with his mental state precisely at the time of the killing of Polonius, his understanding of the nature of his actions and the consequences of his actions. And nothing in my reading of the play, in my reading of the commentaries on the play, or in my direct interview with the prince led me to the conclusion that he was impaired in that moment in that regard.
Well, Doctor, you've told us that Hamlet denied episodes of mania or depression.
Yes.
I suggest to you his anger toward his mother Gertrude and his complicated sexual feelings for her spill into his relationship with Ophelia. Fair?
I think it's fair to say that for all of us, our relationships with our mothers spill into our relationships.
But that's very revealing, Doctor.
We can speak later.
But I suggest to you that it's not often that one's relationship with one's mother, the manic state, is manifested in inappropriate joking and sexual dialogue with Ophelia.
Sir, I would argue that for the experience of mania in the context of manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder, it is not about an inappropriate remark, and I've made thousands of them in my life, but rather a sustained set of symptoms that endures for weeks on end that are highly reproducible, none of which I found evidence for either in the script or in my direct interview with Hamlet. So that people use terms like manic casually to describe people in moments of exuberance, or as Hamlet himself instructs his friend, I may have to put on an antic disposition. And those are Hamlet's words. And that, to me, speaks to the degree of control that he exhibited over symptoms that he manifested.
Well, I suggest to you that there are constant sexual puns, a focus on sexuality relating to both Ophelia and Gertrude, and I suggest that hypersexuality is typical of someone in a manic state. Isn't that true?
It can be, but it's also typical of Shakespeare when he's comic.
Well, you recall that Gertrude says in Act 3, line 4, I was still there when that took place. Nay, but to live in the rank sweat of an unseen bed, stewed in corruption, honeying and making love over the nasty sty. Is this something you'd say to your mother?
No, sir, I would not.
And doctor, would you call your loved one, your girlfriend, your future wife perhaps, wanton, having a painted face, and tell her to get herself to a nunnery?
I didn't marry that one.
I suggest to you, doctor, that at the end of the day, Hamlet displayed all the symptomology of someone in the throes of a schizoaffective disorder. He displayed Oedipal delusions, auditory and visual hallucinations about ghosts, disorganized behavior, acting madly, speaking erratically, exhibiting social dysfunction as demonstrated in his relationship and interactions with his mother and with Ophelia. Aren't those the objective observations of what took place during the transcript that you've read of what took place at the castle?
No, sir, they are not.
Doctor, little can be said about your objectivity.
In the interest of full disclosure, it has to be said that Dr. David Goldblum was not only on the board of the Stratford Festival, he was for a time the chair of this board of the governors, and we had a very good time. Thank you, David Goldblum.
Thank you.
We will now turn things over to the Right Honourable Justice Beverley McLachlin to now hear the appeal.
Yes, I'll call on Appellant's counsel, Ms. Henein, to present her submissions.
Thank you very much. Justices, Ontarians, country people, lend me your ears. I come today to bury Hamlet and Mr. Greenspan, not to praise them. Now, I've put together for you a compendium book, and I'm going to be referring to it, so if I could just hand that up to you. Thank you.
Oh, I have a copy.
Let me, if I can, just set the stage, if you will, for this oral argument. There are numerous facts here today that are not an issue before you. They are admitted by the respondent. That Hamlet killed Polonius is admitted. That Hamlet deliberately intended to kill the person behind the curtain, thinking it was Claudius, is admitted. That he callously then disposed of the body is admitted. That he tried to kill Claudius is admitted. That he had planned and deliberated over the murder, going so far as to create a ruse of a play, is admitted, and that he deliberately sent Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to their death is admitted. There is no dispute to any of this, and when confronted with crime upon crime upon crime, what does Hamlet say to you? He says all of those acts, every single one, occurred because he was so overcome with grief. He was distraught at his father's murder, and he was driven into madness. But I submit to you, those are not the acts or words of madness. They are deliberated, calculated acts of a murderer. And his brief bouts of emotion do not detract from that. There is method to his madness. An antic disposition by any other name is malingering. This is a feigned psychosis. Justices, Hamlet has fooled many for hundreds of years. Draping himself in obscenely puffy shirts, pretending to be a brooding, tortured, conflicted, romantic soul. But frankly, he is nothing more than a self-absorbed, cold-blooded, adolescent, malingering misogynist. And it does not matter how many times he tousles his hair while stomping around on stage, or how he searingly looks at the audience with his blue eyes. He remains a malingering misogynist. It's time for this honorable court to have the courage to finally put an end to his interminable whininess and call him out to be the cold-blooded murderer and sexist cad that we all know in our hearts he truly is.
Are you suggesting, Ms. Henein, that we have to date been cowardly in this matter, that our conscience is unsound?
Yes, I believe so, Justice. I believe he
May
thinks...
you wear that with the Chief Justice.
I think he believes that frailty, thy name is woman, but self-absorbed whininess, thy name is Hamlet. What's next, I ask you, Justices? What greater insult and perpetration of a lie will this man advance next? A charter defense, Justice Moldaver? They too are equally imaginary. His morbid tendency to introspection, excessive, boring self-absorption, and lengthy, tortured monologues that are no different than the ramblings of a schoolgirl writing in her diary must stop. And when he is talking to himself, about what he is thinking, about what he is going to do, about what he is feeling, which he does more than any other person throughout all of mankind. In all of that, there is no madness, just navel-gazing. Only the dim-witted Polonius believes his madness, and I know all three of you are smarter than that. The proof, Justices, is in fact in the pudding. His own words, his conduct prove he does not suffer from any mental disorder. And I just want to briefly take you to the breakdown of the compendium, if I may. I've broken down the compendium into three key areas that I want to address with you today very briefly. The first section is a ghost by any other name. I'm going to come back to that. The second is misogyny, a brooding bore. And thirdly, I want to talk about the artifice of madness. So let me just briefly address the question of ghosts. I expect my friend will harp, as he did at trial, on the fact that the respondent's tendency to see ghosts and occasionally speak to them, is indicative of his madness. 42% of Americans believe in ghosts. Polls also indicate that 32% of them believe in Donald Trump.
Ms. Henein, you're making a very strong case for madness. You know that.
Well, what is a greater indicator of madness, Justice Moldaver? I think the answer is obvious. Hamlet is more sane than a third of the American population. This research, by the way, was provided to me by my colleague, Mr. Gorley, so I cannot take all credit for it.
I never relied on Mr. Gurley's research myself.
That was wise, Justice. That was wise, Chief Justice. I can tell you that before Hamlet sees the ghost, we know that three people, Horatio, Bernardo, Marcellus, all see the ghost not once, not twice, but 3 times. And my friend does not for a moment suggest that they are insane. In fact, the ghost's provocative statements about Claudius inciting Hamlet to murder fall under the co-conspirators' exception to the hearsay rule. And they provide clear corroboration of what is a well-known motive, revenge. Let me take you to the question of misogyny. It's not a question, it's been clearly answered. This man is unfit to walk the earth. His cruel use of Ophelia to advance his plan is extreme. Mistaken by Freud for some complicated Oedipal complex is really just a petulant guy. His medical records are replete with the same diagnosis, adolescent petulance. Although he's 30 years old, he's still in university. He still lives at home. He has not left. He is very sucky around his mother. He disguises his madness, his true self, his wit, his intelligence, with madness that, if you look through the play, seems to be extremely convenient. It comes and goes. And I expect my friend is going to say, well, look at what he does when Ophelia, finally tortured by his interminable, broody sulkiness, cannot handle it anymore. Of course, he also kills her father, which adds to the whole problem. That doesn't demonstrate madness. That demonstrates a brief moment of remorse, which he overcomes so quickly, having known that he was responsible for Ophelia's death. But in the end, isn't it Hamlet's own words that put the lie to him? He tells you that he will put on an antic disposition. And if you read the speech in its entirety, he says he will put on an antic disposition for a reason. It is to avenge his father's death. Those are not the words of a madman. Those are the words of a very manipulative person. This is one of the motives that's the oldest and sanest in the history of mankind. It's one of revenge. These are the acts of a sane and masterful manipulator. His verbal diarrhea, to be sure, is an affliction for us all, but it shouldn't be confused with any mental disorder. He's really an oversharer. He's a... His bouts of conscience are feigned, and as one author, I think his name was Shakespeare, said, conscience is but a word that cowards used, devised at first to keep the strong in awe. And I urge you not to be awed by this actor, to be strong, and to set aside the finding of mental disorder. I know that brevity is the soul of wit, and I believe that my friend Mr. Greenspan will need all the time that he can get. But of course, I am, as always, open to questions from the bench.
I have one, Ms. Henein. If, as you would have it, Hamlet was but acting, what are we to make of the fact that he performed in Denmark at a time close to the date of these events, both the Shakespearean play Hamlet and The Alchemist by Ben Jonson on the same day? Does that not reveal insanity?
It reveals his sanity, Justice Cronk, because he is able to move from one fake role to another. And it reveals his strong constitution. You know, he has a habit of wandering around and complaining and whining and dropping to his knees and at one point, I think, hitting his head. But how quickly he is able to move from one stage to another, performing completely different characters as he does throughout his life. So in my respectful submission, that's indicative of his strong sanity and his intelligence.
You clearly didn't see both plays.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Henein.
Thank you, Chief Justice.
We'll call on Mr. Greenspan.
Chief Justice, the court, the defense will not be trumped by my friend's position. And quite frankly, it's our position that the lady doth protest too much. In our respectful submission, Hamlet's madness is apparent throughout the record. The jury quite properly arrived at the conclusion that he was not criminally responsible for Polonius's death, as he failed to appreciate the nature of his actions. Indeed, not only was Hamlet suffering from a serious schizophrenic episode at the time of the killing, the record is rife with examples of his schizoaffective disorder as well as his bipolar disorder leading to Polonius's tragic death. And although Dr. Goldblum has opined that Hamlet was not suffering from mental disorder, that is neither borne out by the record nor the observations of his family and friends. It's the position of the respondent that the Crown has failed to demonstrate any error of law which could justify a new trial. Moreover, it's the position of the respondent that the finding of not criminally responsible was correct and indeed the only reasonable disposition. Let me deal with a select survey of many of what I might call Shakespeare's crazy characters. We can't always look toward a group of crazy people to prove a separate person's insanity.
Are you referring to similar fact evidence?
Well, to some extent only drawing from the history not only of the record but the history of the creator and author of this character in the long line of characters to which we celebrate Shakespeare's greatness. And in fact, any of Shakespeare's main characters are often faced with stress. It's a short voyage from stress to madness. King Lear, and perhaps King Lear as to some extent, a similar act. He tries to divide his kingdom between his daughters, only to see everything fall apart. He goes a tad crazy.
It's called a confederation.
Indeed, Chief Justice. But in doing so, he screams, and we don't know how many of our fathers of Confederation did this, for the oak-cleaving thunderbolts to singe his white head. Certainly not going to help him think his way out of the situation. And, of course, there's the hunchback, Richard III, and that fellow, not such a good guy. When stress comes to him, when all of his double-dealing ends in war, he goes crazy. He says, my horse, my kingdom for a horse," he cries out, making what could only be thought of as a lopsided trade offer that was certainly a sign of insanity. And then Romeo
Mr.
and Juliet.
Greenspan, have you never prepared yourself to stand before a court of appeal and said, "My kingdom for a case"?
Depends on the size of the retainer, Chief.
I have attempted to to prepare myself for the slings and arrows of outrageous questions. Might I simply say Romeo and Juliet, and they've often been called star-crossed lovers. But indeed, and we have to analyze this very carefully in a modern context, at the end of the play, when Juliet discovers that Leonardo DiCaprio lies dead before her, she doesn't follow the sane, rational path that Rose did in Titanic. She doesn't try to survive. No, in a desperately stressful situation, she does not control herself, instead slipping into temporary mania. Macbeth, in his stressful moment, can only take comfort because he believes that a boy ghost is telling him that a forest can't walk. And now Hamlet, indeed Shakespeare's quintessential character, facing extreme stress. His father is dead. He discovers that he was murdered. His possible Freudian love of his mother has been usurped by his uncle. There is war. There are people with very long first names being sent to kill him. And now, with all of these stressors in Shakespeare's history, how could anyone be so presumptuous as to conclude Hamlet is not mad? Let me perhaps deal with this notion of feigning madness. What would he have to gain from malingering? Feigning madness does not advance Hamlet's goal. There was either a ghost or it was a delusion. If it was a ghost, why put on an antic disposition, as it could only interfere with his pursuit of justice? The suggestion that he was feigning madness is eloquently contradicted even in the evidence of Dr. Goldblum, when Dr. Goldblum reports that Hamlet denies feeling depressed or having suicidal thoughts. If Hamlet's claim to madness is counterfeit, he would exaggerate, not deny his mental illness. I suggest it's not a rational strategy to deny insanity in pursuit of a finding of not criminally responsible. Let me take you to an interpretation and perhaps, quite frankly, an apt comparison. The court need not adopt my analysis of Hamlet's psychosis. There are those who have studied my client more extensively than either myself or Dr. Goldblum. For example, several films have been made about his story. And each time the actors and directors must analyze the story to a point that would make our investigation superficial. And as authority for that proposition, I draw the court's attention to the 1994 Disney film, The Lion King. Which, if you consider it as an adaptation of this source. To refresh you on the plot, the boy Prince Simba leaves the kingdom.
Mr. Greenspan, as so often with your arguments on appeal, I'm utterly lost. Be careful.
And yet, no.
Mr. Greenspan, I'm with you still. I want you to know that. And I want you to know that I understood The Lion King, but Hamlet may be another matter.
And what we see by this unusual juxtaposition is, although Justice Cronk is often confused by my argument, she often is with me. Justice Moldover, who understands my argument, is never.
Well, I can see you haven't lost your sanity, Mr. Greenspan.
Let me simply try to refresh your memory on the plot of The Lion King. The boy Prince, and I'll take this slowly. The boy Prince Simba leaves the kingdom after his father Mufasa is murdered by his uncle, Uncle Scar. Simba's father appears to him as a ghost cloud, telling him what happened, telling him to avenge him, and exciting him until he sings about how he can't just wait to be king.
Could we at some point, Mr. Greenspan, address the evidence in this case?
Yes, I will. Well, let me, if I just might complete the one thought. Spending millions of hours analyzing their Hamlet character, they give him a life philosophy. It's called Hakuna Matata. And how do Timon and Pumbaa, the philosopher's creators, describe it? They describe their sociopathic credo, now I get to the point, clearly one shared by Hamlet, as evidenced by his senseless murder of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, as one of no worries, as a craze, and specifically that it ain't no passing craze. One that persists, that lingers, that rots the brain, an all-encompassing craze, and it afflicts Simba the lion just as it affects Hamlet the Dane. Let me...
Can you give us a verse or two from Can You Feel the Love Tonight?
Let me very briefly deal with my friend's submissions on the ghost, because much has been said about the ghost of Hamlet's late father. It's true that the ghost is an apparition seen by others. Seeing a ghost in Shakespearean plays is, of course, not necessarily indicative of madness. Shakespeare created a world where witches and fairies were real. Notably, Horatio and the Centuries call out to the apparition, begging it to speak. It remains silent. The ghost does not reveal the true state of affairs in the tragic murder of King Hamlet. One would think that a ghost who has unfinished business on earth because he was murdered, who is obsessed with truth, justice, and revenge, would spread the word of Claudius' deceit to his trusted advisors and his son's friends, but he remains silent. It's only when Hamlet converses with the ghost, conveniently out of earshot of the others, that the ghost speaks. He speaks as a person, in full iambic pentameter. The ghost is only a speaking character in Hamlet's unstable mind, a mind shattered by grief. And in the pivotal scene in Gertrude's bedchamber, the ghost reappears, but only to Hamlet. Gertrude can neither hear nor see the apparition. Hamlet is not only experiencing an auditory hallucination, but a visual one as well. And at this point, that Gertrude's concern for Hamlet's mental state reaches its zenith. It is precisely at the moment of the murder of Polonius that his mother is most convinced of Hamlet's insanity. Alas, she cries out, "We must agree, he is mad," then clearly a mother knows best. Let me draw to a conclusion with the actions right after killing Polonius. Let's examine Hamlet's words and deeds during and after the murder of Polonius, as in my submission, it's clear that he lacks any appreciation of reality, let alone an appreciation of the morality of his actions. Polonius cries out from behind the arras. Hamlet immediately stabs him without thinking. When it becomes clear that Hamlet has stabbed someone, Gertrude exclaims, "O me, what hast thou done?" To which Hamlet replies, "Nay, I know not. Is it the king?" But he is not concerned with revenge, quite apparently, as he's not sure who he stabbed. He doesn't care.
But why isn't that just a simple case of transferred intent, Mr. Greenspan?
Probably shouldn't have mentioned that to you last night. But since I did, the reaction itself, had it been a mistake, what does he do? He ignores the body. He continues to berate his mother. He continues to challenge her. The Queen says, "Oh, what a rash and bloody deed is this?" And Hamlet says, "A bloody deed almost as bad, good mother, as kill a king and marry with his brother." So he's totally unconcerned about the fact, even if it was transferred intent, that he made a mistake. He doesn't care. It's not within his scope of understanding and his understanding of the reality of what took place.
True, but it's not as though Polonius was his best friend. I think you'd have to agree with that. In fact, he was one of the conspirators, wasn't he?
Well, he realizes, when he does realize it's Polonius, he doesn't react with remorse or regret.
No.
Indeed, he doesn't even attend to the bloody corpse that's lying on the ground. He continues simply to berate his mother. That's his focus. That's what the event is all about. It has nothing to do with the reality of a homicide. Clearly, in our respectful submission to the court, as the jury held and as the Crown has failed to demonstrate error on appeal, Hamlet's mental disorder affected his ability to appreciate the nature and quality of his act, as well as the fact that the act was wrong. Again, we need only recall his behavior at the time of the killing. Those are my respectful submissions to the court.
Thank you, Mr. Greenspan. Reply.
Brief
Ms. Henein.
reply. Thank you, Chief Justice. The only issue before you today is whether Hamlet was unable to appreciate the nature and quality of his act, or whether he was merely acting, something Hamlet is known to do. Mr. Greenspan's submissions are a fairy tale based in Disney. And I note that Justice Moldaver appeared to be very familiar with all the songs in Lion King. That's very charming. Who knew you were so soft? The devil can cite scripture for his purpose, and I'm not suggesting that Mr. Greenspan is the devil, just his client. But we've seen this before. A man sees a ghost, claims they're mad, kills a bunch of people, hates women. Justices, this is the stuff of plays, not the law or a courtroom. This man is as sane as this audience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, normally on such an important and difficult case, we would reserve judgment, but the management has decreed we must give our views immediately. I will call upon Justice Cronk first.
Thank you, Chief Justice. In the privacy of these intimate deliberations, I shall be candid, and also, unlike Polonius, I shall be brief. The law, as of course you know, is an enterprise of great pith and moment. Yet how can it assign the mind of a man? Who among us has not sought to sleep, to end the heartache, to sleep? Indeed, I aim for it every day in life, perchance to dream. If this is the madness marker, are we not all mad? Who among us is not, at sometimes at least, northwest, slightly deranged? Yet when the moment passes, do we not know what's what? The Crown asks us to declare that Hamlet, the man before you, a man overcome by profound grief at the loss of his father and his king, betrayed and humiliated by his beloved mother, and betrayed by his lover, was at the relevant time when he thrust at Polonius of sound mind, at least for the purpose of the law. Yet might not those combined factors, overwhelming grief, betrayal and humiliation by his mother, his lover, and the mother of his putative child, so have imperiled his reason at that moment that he did not appreciate what he did on the sudden. Some might say parenthetically that it was in any event a favor to the state of Denmark to rid it of Polonius. As neither counsel have spent time addressing the evidence in a very short way, may I just remind us, Chief Justice, Justice Moldaver, what it is that we have to consider. What is the objective evidence in this case? First, the opinion of Dr. Goldblum. He presumes to judge the soundness of another's mind. This a man who believes he's Groucho Marx? A man who, in his 99-page CV, I printed it out on my home computer, has spent so many years assessing those said to be ill or feigning illness, it's questionable whether he can tell any longer the difference. How can it be that the trial judge viewed his opinion as reliable? I am disinclined to accord his flippant, cavalier, facetious, albeit eloquent and articulate opinion much weight. It is conclusory and overreaching. And his admission Hamlet's admission to Dr. Goldblum that he had messed up, well, how understandable is that? The man agreed to meet with Dr. Goldblum. What's the second source of objective evidence? It's the accused's own utterances. But Justice Hamlet, as you've been reminded, professed his avowed intention to act strange or odd and to put an antic disposition on. So too did he later confess his acts to have been the product of madness. But what was the pattern of his speech? What were the observations of others? Because Dr. Goldberg has told us today that he relied on their observations of Hamlet to found his opinion. How can those witnesses be seen as reliable and not self-interested? First, Polonius, the first to declare Hamlet mad, from love no less. If that be so, how many of us are crazy north, west, south, and east? Yet even he, Polonius, is unsure, declaring, quote, though this be madness, that yet there is method in it. And Claudius, is he reliable? It suits well his purpose to accept the claim of Hamlet's madness. How better a way to rid himself of a threat from the true heir to the throne? And he too is unsure. Recall his words, quote, what he spake, though it lacked form, a little was not like madness. Claudius sought not the truth, but a vehicle to advance his own interests. Ophelia's view, how can that poor woman's opinion be relied upon? I have no sympathy for Hamlet's treatment of Ophelia, but recall how it came about. He meets with his lover and is confronted with the return of his love letters. He realizes then, with a distraught face on Ophelia, that they are not alone. And he says, where is your father? And in that moment, he understands that his lover, who visibly is pregnant, has betrayed him, that she's been manipulated by the other men in her life, and that he stands utterly humiliated. In those circumstances, might it not be, and how can we say that it is not so, that he was so overwhelmed by the combined grief, betrayal, and humiliation to which he'd been exposed, that he utterly snapped? And how can a court of law say that that did not occur once the opinion of Dr. Goldblum, as I say, it must and should have been by the trial judge, discounted? There is no objective evidence here of unsound mind. And what of the ghost? Recall, others saw the ghost. Who are we to say that that does not occur to invited persons? And only Hamlet heard the ghost thereafter. With considerable thought, but very little time today to consider the matter further, before I would condemn a man as a criminal, the quality of his acts, with the seriousness that the law accords to that, more cogent proof indeed is required. I would dismiss this appeal, Chief Justice.
Thank you, Justice Cronk. I call on Justice Moldaver.
Well, your observations, Mr. Greenspan, would appear to be bang on so far. It looks like you got Justice Cronk.
Someone's got to stand up for the underprivileged.
But since this is the first time that Ms. Henein has ever acted for the Crown, I've got to take that into account. Ladies and gentlemen, actually, and thank you, Chief Justice, I'd like to begin by commending Ms. Henein and Mr. Greenspan and Dr. Goldblum on their fine, fine performances. I mean, I want to assure you what they have done today is not easy. But to a person, in my view, and I'm sure in yours, they excelled. And each deserves our sincere thanks. High praise. Now down to business. One of the themes that courses through the Shakespeare's Hamlet is the unpredictability of life. I'm sure many of you have experienced it. I know I have. Indeed, Life never ceases to amaze me, and today is no exception.
This is sounding like one of your better judgments.
No? I hope you'll concur, Chief. If someone had told me 25 years ago when I first became a judge that someday I would be sitting on stage at the Stratford Festival Theatre along with the Chief Justice in Canada and a distinguished member of the Court of Appeal for Ontario, judging a murder case on a Saturday morning before an audience of 1,200 people, I would have got on the phone right away to Dr. Goldblum and said, "Doctor, do I have a patient for you?" Life never ceases to amaze. And what makes this event doubly amazing for me is the fact that during my high school years, Mr. Shakespeare and I were not what you would call bosom buddies. Not to put too fine a point on it, I rarely understood a thing he said. Every word, every phrase, every thought had at least 2 and sometimes 3 meanings, and I would come out of English class and my head would be spinning. If I tell you that I found Chaucer to be a walk in the park compared to Shakespeare, you'll have some idea of the depth of my despair. All I can say is thank God for Cole's notes. If it weren't for Cole's notes, I'd still be in grade 10. Now, it's important, ladies and gentlemen, that you have confidence in your judiciary. And from what I have just told you, you will see at once how well qualified and uniquely positioned I am to look into Mr. Shakespeare's mind and resolve the issue that presents itself today, namely, when Hamlet killed Polonius, was he sad, mad, or just plain old bad? And I want to cut to the chase with you, and I don't want to keep you in suspense. And in any event, for me, the answer is really quite simple and straightforward. I don't know. No, that's not it. But brevity is the soul of wit, but I'm going to go on a little bit more. Hamlet may have been legally insane when he killed Polonius, and on the other hand, he may not have been legally insane. And that's the kind of insight, ladies and gentlemen, that has marked my judicial career. and enabled me to ascend to this country's highest court. But I make no apologies for my ambivalence. The fault lies with Shakespeare. Much as I didn't know him personally, I sensed that he was a bit of a rascal. He had a mischievous streak in him, and in this play, as I see it, he purposely leaves us to wonder on which side of the line Hamlet falls. Be that as it may, if push came to shove and I were pressed for an answer, I would find that when Hamlet killed Polonius, he was not mad. Rather, he was bad with an explanation. A couple of things stand out for me in this regard. First, apart from the odd exception that can easily be explained, whenever Hamlet is alone and or whenever we are exposed to his innermost feelings, whether he be alone or not, to me he comes across as sane and rational. The same holds true when he is with people he trusts, or at least has no reason to distrust. Second, Hamlet, don't take this personally. There's still a sentencing phase to come. Hamlet is born with a silver spoon in his mouth. And from what I can make out, until age 30, he doesn't have a care in the world. Life is just one big bowl of cherries. And then at the age of 30, suddenly and unexpectedly, his world comes crashing down. His father dies under suspicious circumstances. His mother hops into bed with his uncle before his poor father's bones, while his poor father's bones are still cold. He sees Uncle Claudius as a boor and a lout. He worries that the kingdom of Denmark is at risk. He finds no solace in religion, and on and on and on. Overnight, he comes to realize that the world can be, and at times is, a very nasty place in which people cheat, lie, deceive, and even commit murder to get what they want. And so he starts to reflect on life for the first time ever in his life. And yes, he gets down, and yes, he gets depressed, and yes, he begins to question the value of life and whether life is worth living. But who wouldn't? Sounds like me when I got my first set of marks in law school. And I stood in the bottom quarter and failed torts. That's true, by the way. No comment, Chief Justice. Anyway, as I've said, I need not finally resolve the matter. Had the onus been on the Crown to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Hamlet was sane when he killed Polonius, I might have had a doubt. But the law is clear. Under Section 16 of the Criminal Code, Hamlet bears the onus of establishing, on a balance of probabilities, which, in a fancy way of saying more likely than not, that when he killed Polonius, he was suffering from a disease of the mind which rendered him incapable of appreciating the physical consequences of his act, or of knowing that it was either morally or legally wrong. Sorry, Mr. Greenspan, but your client doesn't meet any of these hurdles in my book, and to the extent the trial judge found otherwise, I am inclined to think that he erred in law in effectively shifting the onus of proof onto the Crown, instead of placing it squarely on Hamlet, where it clearly belonged. In short, if pressed, I would allow the appeal. But take heart, Mr. Greenspan, all is not lost. Few of us have ever had the opportunity of acting for a prince. Might I suggest you take some of the fees that you received and go on a Scandinavian cruise? You'll feel like $1 million.
Well, I must begin by thanking everyone who's participated. We had today stellar performances from our witness, Dr. Goldblum, from counsel for the appellant and counsel for the respondent. And I noticed as he sulked at the witness table, the accused also gave a very, very convincing performance. Thank you. We have before us a question of great difficulty. At the heart of this play, the question is, and no one has ever been able to answer it, but we are expected to do so today, was Hamlet mad when he killed Polonius? Did he understand and appreciate the nature and quality of his acts, such that he should not be held criminally responsible? There's a lot to be said, and a lot has been said on both sides. For the proposition that Hamlet was mad, we have visions, we have ghosts, and we have bizarre behavior. But then on the other hand, Shakespeare has been known on occasion to over-dramatize the matter. It reminds me of a submission I once received from counsel when I was a trial judge, and I pointed out the difficulty on both sides of the case, including the side he was attempting to present. And he threw down his hands and he said, "Well, milady, there are the pros and cons for it and the pros and cons against it." However, we are obliged, it is our lot in life as judges, to make decisions where others would more wisely refrain. And so I must, as my colleagues have, proceed. And there are many things that could and have been said, but let me say this. Normally, we judges like to think we decide cases on the facts and on the law. And we like to tell the public that that's what we do. But I have to say in this case, I find the facts abominably thin. And the law is, just with respect to the onus point which I take, Mr. Justice Moldaver correctly made, onus being on the accused to demonstrate insanity. The law is not terribly helpful to me, I find, in this case. So what does a judge do when the law and the facts don't help? Well, the Supreme Court of Canada has very helpfully come up with two pieces of advice for a judge facing this dilemma. First, he should look at she should look at the historical pattern, the historical context. And second, he or she should look at the personal context. So that is what I have done. Now, historically, I found a very compelling case to demonstrate that seeing visions is no indication of madness. We in Canada, above all, should know this to be true. Indeed, we have proof positive in the person of one of our eminent prime ministers, the Right Honourable Mackenzie King, who regularly convenes seances to seek guidance on critical matters of state and the governance of our great nation. Hamlet saw his father on the battlements. Prime Minister Mackenzie King consulted his mother, long dead, as the country's troops fought and died in World War II. We all know that Prime Minister King was not mad. Ergo, Hamlet cannot have been mad. Having considered the historical context, I thought my conclusion sound, but to test the merits of it, I decided to consider the personal context of Hamlet. Now, Hamlet was two things. He was an actor, and he was a politician. And I shall briefly discuss how each points to his sanity. First of all, Hamlet was an actor, as we all know. He managed to act not only in one play, but in two plays in the same play. And only a true actor will do this. And we also know that what is sanity for an ordinary person is insanity for an actor, and what is insanity in an actor is often sanity for an ordinary person. Actors are not to be judged when it comes to their sanity by the standards of the ordinary person. But my even more compelling point, it seemed to me, is Hamlet's identity as a politician. Hamlet was a prince, the premier politician of his age. He wasn't in power, but he was certainly trying to be leader of the opposition. And he felt that a grave injustice had occurred, that his uncle had unconstitutionally usurped the throne and the governance of Denmark. Well, in Canada, there would have been no problem since whenever, because Hamlet would have gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, and he would have brought a constitutional challenge to his uncle, and of course he would have won. But poor Hamlet, and here I do have some sympathy, what were you to do? There was no Supreme Court of Denmark to solve your problem, and so you had to take it into your own hands. Nevertheless, were you mad in doing so? No, you were acting as a prince of state, as a politician. Now, you're saying, what's that got to do with it? Everything, I reply. Politicians, as everyone knows, are not mad. Yet consider the following indisputable facts. First of all, politicians are not uncommonly charged with having, if not visions, vision. Now I hasten to say there are those who say that this quality is lacking in the politicians currently fighting in the current electoral campaign. But the general point stands. Secondly, politicians are on occasion accused of having hallucinations. For example, as when they say, I promise to always balance the budget, or I have balanced the budget. When everybody really knows it's a bit of smoke and mirrors and a dip into the unemployment fund. Thirdly, politicians not infrequently run their rapiers through arrases, I struggled over that, or curtains, of obfuscation without really knowing who's on the other side or what's behind the curtain. Or to use a metaphor associated with another literary figure, they occasionally are accused of tilting at windmills. This quality in politicians is completely compatible with 100% sanity. Fourthly, politicians are known to be paranoid. But so what? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean there's that there's not somebody out there to get you. And fifthly and finally, Hamlet tells Polonius, the respected philosopher, that he knows him excellent well and that he's a fishmonger. In other words, he's talking nonsense. But politicians often talk nonsense. In modern parlance, this is called voorbijreden, or talking past the point, indicating that the person understands the question but is deliberately talking about another topic. We all know politicians do this all the time, but are they mad? Absolutely not. Therefore, I am driven by the historical record and the contextual context of this case, the contextual matrix of this case, to conclude that Hamlet, as an actor and as a politician, is entirely sane and was so when he so sadly stabbed the philosopher Polonius. Thank you very much all for your attendance, for your attention, for being with us on this wonderful occasion. And please forgive me if I say, as I must, that the appeal is allowed.
Sorry. You're going to jail. Can you tell Brian though that he's got an automatic right of appeal to the Supreme Court of
I
Canada?
just want to say,
Mr. Green.
I just want to say, Mr. Chimolino, you've seen yet the most recent illustration of my experience with the Supreme Court of Canada, 2-1. I've lived to learn with it.
But Mr. Greenspan, you do have an automatic right of appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada. I'm not sure that will give your client a great deal of comfort. Thank you all.
Chief Justice, if I... Chief Justice, if I may say just a few words of thank you in closing. First of all, you know, Hamlet talks about the law's delay, and in this case, though it took 415 years, justice delayed was not justice denied, Jonathan. And he'll be performing the part a little bit differently, I sense, in the future. Yeah. Just a few words of thank you. First of all, thank you to all of you for coming out today and making this event so very special. Thank you. I want to thank as well Michael Meehan and Kelly Meehan and the TR Meehan Foundation, which sponsor the whole of our forum events so generously. Please. I'd like to thank Dr. Lee Myers, who set up a fund in memory of Dr. Phil Henein for our speaker series, and her support is deeply appreciated. Finally, to Guy and Mary, who couldn't be here today. Wow, did they miss a treat? Thank you, Guy and Mary. And just a few final words of thank you to all the people who worked and brought us this entertainment today. This took a lot of work. There was a lot of time spent poring over the script. And I know that David spent a considerable amount of time and had to have coffee with a Danish. And thank you, Jonathan, for being here today, because I know how busy you are. And talk about busy and healthy hourly rates. They're two counsels giving their time, volunteering their time today. Thank you. And on behalf of Anita Gaffney, our Executive Director, and Kira Logren, I'd like to say a special thank you to the justices who came here today. Justice is a very big part of Shakespeare's examination of our society. It comes up again and again in these plays. And I think what we learned today was not only new things about Hamlet and the Lion King, and politicians. But we learned that in a democracy where keeping the flame of justice alive is so vitally important, that our justices are not only smart and witty, but they have a great sense of humor. So thank you very much. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you.